Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating guest. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hello, everyone. I am Mark Lovett. It is a pleasure to be here on the show today and share a little bit about my journey into storytelling. So for me, personal storytelling actually began in the world of business. And this is when I became part of a startup company. This is back in the 1980s. And during this time, I happened to have a mentor who taught me that everything in business was really a story. It was a story of our company, story of our employees, of our customers. In fact, every product had a story. And the way that you became successful in business was when those stories could align so that the story you were telling is the story that the customer wanted to hear. And during that period of time, I served in many roles, from vice president of operations to chief marketing officer, chief information officer, and even president and CEO of one company, all within this one computer industry. After a couple of decades, I decided that it was time for me to move on. I left the corporate world and I began consulting, doing business strategy consulting for a variety of companies. And one of those companies was a startup company that was involved in digital marketing. And the president of that company introduced me to TEDx. Many of you probably know about the TED conference and you've watched TED Talks. Back in 2009, they created a new program called TEDx. And the X just meant that these were external to TED, that they were going to allow individuals to create TED-like conferences in their own city. And so my client actually started TEDx San Diego. And that was the first TEDx event that I was able to attend. And it was amazing to see people get up on stage to tell personal stories that were impactful, that were about their own life experiences in some cases. And in other cases, they were about new ideas, problems, and solutions in society. And I thought that this was just an incredible format to allow people to tell their story, people who are generally not famous enough to end up on network television. So after a couple of years of watching his show, he invited me to be the co-organizer of TEDx San Diego. And we produced one event together back in 2014. And at the end of that event, he said, "Mark, why don't you take the license?" He had another startup he was going to get involved with. So I took on the license for TEDx San Diego. Over a 6-year period, my team and I produced 20 different TEDx events. Some of those were small events of 100 people in a very controlled environment. Our large events were 1,800 people in Symphony Hall. We would bring a dozen speakers on stage to talk about all kinds of subjects, from their personal life experiences to science and astronomy, architecture, you name it, we put somebody on stage to speak about that subject. We also produced a very unique event on the US-Mexico border. We built one stage in the United States and one stage in Mexico because we had partnered with TEDx Tijuana. And we alternated our speakers back and forth from one country to the other because there was only a border fence in between. And what we were trying to do was demonstrate the fact that even if you build walls and fences and you have laws and you control immigration, you can never prevent two cultures from interacting, from sharing their lives, sharing their culture, sharing their stories, their food, their art, their music. And that was very true of San Diego in California and Tijuana in Baja California in Mexico. So that event was really an eye-opener as to the international ability for stories to connect people. We also produced two events inside of a California state prison. Those events had half speakers from the outside world and half speakers from the inmates themselves. The audience was also half from the outside. Half of those people were from the inside. And it was amazing to see these people interact with each other and hear each other's stories. And it had never occurred to me that inmates would have these impactful personal stories. But of course, their lives had been tragic in many respects. They had gotten involved in drugs and got involved with crime. They ended up in jail serving their sentence. But they learned something from the experience. They learned things about themselves and about the world outside that they wanted to share on the stage. Our final event was a youth event. That's a special license from TED that is really targeted towards high school students. This can be a combination of students and outside people speaking. But in my case, I decided that all of the speakers were going to be students. All of the performers would be students, and the MCs would be students. In fact, the joke was my rule said no adults allowed on stage. So these were 16 and 17-year-old students who had never been on stage, never told a story before. And they were being asked to share a very intimate part of themselves. And they rehearsed, they worked on their manuscript. We had speaker coaches that worked with all of them. And in the end, they put on an event that was really quite remarkable. And we got to hear their voices. And they not only spoke on stage and gained their own level of self-confidence from telling their personal story, but the audience was filled with other students. And it impacted them greatly. During the breaks and during lunch, I went and talked to these students. And they said, because my fellow student was up on stage, I now feel empowered and inspired to tell my own story, to speak my own truth. And so that's one of the aspects of personal storytelling, is that it's not just the people on the stage, it's the people who hear the story. So through all of these events, all of these thousands of people, these dozens of speakers that came on stage, this was really a revelation for me as to the power of personal storytelling, more so than the power of business storytelling was during my career. So during this process, I started coaching other speakers, people who were not coming onto the TEDx stage, people who were going to go speak at professional conferences, people who simply wanted to learn how to tell their personal story, how to structure it, how to dive deep into it. So that became a career for me. I moved away from my business consulting practice, and I started coaching speakers full-time, which is what I do today. And during this period of time, I've worked with such a range of folks. I've worked with educators, professors at universities, helping them tell the story about the kind of work that they do, what they've discovered in their life, what their path was to achieve that level of notoriety within the university, that they became a subject matter expert. I've worked with scientists who are studying oceanography and biology and neuroscience, teaching them how to make their stories more personal. Because scientists, especially PhDs, have a way of speaking that is very technical, which is fine if they're talking to other PhD scientists. But when they're speaking to the general public, they need to explain their science in a way that the public is going to understand. And so I help them create those kinds of stories. I worked with a nonprofit organization helping special forces personnel come back into society when they retired. Now, these are people who have lived a life that's really in secret. They're not allowed to talk about the kinds of things that they do, the kind of work that they're involved in. But now they need to come into society, they need to apply for a job, they need to be able to tell their personal story. They need to understand how their skills that were learned in one area could apply to another area. And so that was a very different sort of process. So going from special forces to scientists to educators. I've also worked with a lot of students at universities. Students who want to understand how the power of story can shape their career, can shape their education, and how it will apply to them once they get into the real world. Now, I thought I left the world of TEDx behind because I used to do those events in San Diego, California. And a few years ago, I moved halfway around the world to where I'm at right now in Lisbon, Portugal. And I said, that's it, I'm done with TEDx. But I happened to meet the organizer for the TEDx here in Lisbon. And this event just occurred last week. And I offered to give them some assistance, which turned into coaching a couple of speakers. And these two speakers were very different, but both had amazing stories. One of them is a photojournalist who had an incredible story to tell about his time in Syria during the Syrian revolution in the city of Homs, which was being bombarded on a daily basis. And he was one of those people brave enough to go into a war zone in order to take pictures to show the world what was happening. Today, he's on the front lines in Ukraine doing much the same thing. The Russians are bombing the city where he's at, but he's there to tell a story. Not just his story, of course, he's there to tell other people's stories, which is another aspect of storytelling when you're the one trying to capture somebody's story and bring their story to life. The other speaker I worked with is a young woman who had sailed all the oceans of the world, who had been an activist, who had been really passionate about the environment. This was her calling, to understand what was happening in the oceans and what the story was behind what's happening to the earth. This is a big thing right now, of course, with climate change. But she always also had a passion for art. She liked to sing, she liked to dance, she liked to paint. So she made this decision to change her life, to shift away from sailing the world's oceans to creating art performances that would help increase people's awareness of what was happening to the environment, especially what was happening to the oceans. So in her talk, she was able to show people what she was doing to bring this awareness, but also to inspire people to be brave enough to go out and change their own life, to say, the road is difficult and you don't always know what's going to happen. But if you believe in yourself and you believe in what it is that you're trying to change, that change is possible. So I'm seeing this more and more, that storytelling is coming into this space of social activism, social awareness. I worked with folks that were working on the climate crisis. And of course, these are all personal stories that happen behind the science. It's one thing to talk about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's another to talk about somebody who's been displaced by climate change, or somebody who's standing on their rooftop because their city is flooded, to talk about people caught in storms. And this is going to be increasingly necessary as we get into more severe climate change in the future. So if for any of you who are on the front lines of social causes, this is a perfect opportunity for you to be thinking of not just the numbers and the statistics, but to really be thinking about the human stories behind those numbers, what it is that it means to you, what it means to everybody else.
Wow. Mark, you've had an incredible career in the storytelling space. It's just fascinating how you evolve from one thing to another to another. It's almost like it was scripted and meant to be. They say that stories are doors into other people's worlds. And I think you've really been able to show us how powerful storytelling can be. So you have a rich history in the powerfulness of storytelling, and you've helped countless individuals to craft their narratives. How do you believe the art of storytelling can bridge gaps, foster understanding, and promote diversity in today's interconnected world?
A lot of times people approach storytelling from the standpoint of being right or winning the argument or succeeding or some power motive. For me, the essence of storytelling is about sharing and understanding. So this process of sharing who you are, the experiences you've had, what you think, what you feel, what you know, what you believe, and do that for the sole purpose of trying to help somebody else understand you better, understand themselves better, understand the world around them better. I'm not out to change anybody's mind. I'm just out to increase awareness so that people have the ability to change their own mind in their own personal way.
Now, your project, the TEDx Cross Border Collaborative, had some profound effects. You themed it Ideas Without Borders. Can you share with us a particular memorable moment or story from that event that encapsulated the power of transcending political and physical barriers?
There was a speaker who talked about the environment. And his point was that while we have this fence between the two stages, we have two separate countries, two separate languages, two different sets of rules. Our governments are very different. But what crosses the border is the air, the water, the birds. San Diego and Tijuana sit right on the Pacific Ocean. And from our venue, you could look out and see the ocean. And of course, the ocean has no borders. So it was this powerful message that we might be making decisions on our own. But yet when it comes to the environment, we are one family, we are one planet, that nothing stays in one location, that everything is constantly moving around the globe. And so people shouldn't just be thinking about what's happening in my world, in my city, in my neighborhood. But when it comes to environmental issues, people have to expand their consciousness to really understand that everything we do in one place shows up in another. And I think that this was a good parallel to how our cultures also cross around the globe.
Yeah, everything is connected. So from tech to TEDx, transitioning from senior executive positions into high-tech electronic industries to the world of TEDx and storytelling is quite a shift. How did your experiences in the corporate world influence or shape your approach to storytelling? And what lessons from tech have you carried over to your work in crafting impactful narratives?
So the number one thing that I took with me from the tech world, from my business background, and I brought forward was the power of listening. We always talk about storytelling, which is me telling a story so that I'm speaking and I'm telling what I feel to somebody else. But the power of storytelling really starts with what I call story listening. In the case of business, You have to listen to your customers. Exactly who are they? What are their problems? What are they trying to solve? What are they trying to achieve? And if your story can then satisfy their requirements, their story, then you have a good match, and then you're successful. And so it's this process of listening to people very intently. And there's a lot of people talking about how to listen better. I use that term story listening because to me, it's not just listening for facts and figures. It's listening to other people from a storytelling perspective so that you can understand the story they're telling you. And in the case where you're having a conversation, it gives you that opportunity to interact, to ask questions, to help fill in the blanks of that story. So again, that the more they share, the more you understand.
So I'm really hearing you saying we should be listening to understand more than listening just to respond to something that's being said to you. Now, Mark, you know that a lot of my community are speakers who are aspiring to get onto the TED platform. As a TED organizer, what do you look for when you are selecting your speakers? Give us 3 nuggets of wisdom that potential speakers can take into consideration before they apply.
So one aspect of putting a program together for most TEDx events is that the organizer will start with a theme. And based on that theme, they'll be looking for topics that cover various aspects of that theme. So sometimes it's just the luck of the draw that your topic is something that an organizer is looking for. But that's only going to attract their attention. That's going to make them think this person might be a good candidate for my stage this year to address this theme. But what they're really looking for is somebody with an interesting idea, a new way of expressing what their solution to a problem is. In the case of TED and TEDx, of course, their tagline is ideas worth spreading. So more so than just a pure personal story, the question is, what is the idea that you're going to bring to the audience? I want to know why you're passionate about this idea. I want to know what brought you to this point in your entire life to where right now you want to get up on stage and spread this, words of wisdom that you have. Flip side, I want to know what's in it for the audience. Why would the audience care? And this is where you need to put yourself in their shoes and understand how your message is going to positively affect their life. Because a talk that's interesting to you, but the audience doesn't care about, isn't going to land very well. So it starts with that idea, why you're passionate about it, why the audience is passionate about it.
Now, the TED brand is a very, very powerful brand to have for any speaker. What did becoming a TED speaker do for your career? How did it change how people perceived you as a speaker?
Once I got up on a TEDx stage, and I've been on a couple, it does cast you in a different light. People see you as someone who is possessive of ideas that are worth spreading. You're not passively in the audience just listening, that you are somebody who has some wisdom that you want to share, that you have some life experiences. In my case, it brought people to me that saw how I crafted stories, and they wanted to do the same with their career. They wanted to do the same on their stage. So that ability to speak will then influence people to see you as a speaker and as a thought leader.
Now, in preparing for your presentation, what is the structure of a good TED Talk? How should one put it together?
Oh, that's an interesting question because I tell people that there is no one structure. There's no formula. There's no magic, do this, this, and this, and voila, a great story is going to come out. Just as every person is different, every story is different, and every story structure is a little different. So besides organizing my events, I've been to TED and TEDx events around the world. This TEDx here in Lisbon was my 93rd event that I've attended. So I've seen a couple thousand speakers on stage delivering their stories. And with any story, it does come back to what is your idea and why do you care about it and why does the audience care about it? And when the audience cares about something, they're interested. So your actual narrative, the story and the way you tell it, just like a good book or a good movie, needs to attract someone's attention and hold their attention throughout the entire story. Your opening needs to be able to grab their attention, so it has to be interesting. And then your conclusion needs to wrap things up so that people understand what the point of your story was. So I divide stories up into what I call story blocks. And these are mini stories that you put together to make a complete story. Think of chapters in a book or even scenes in a movie. So examine your life story and examine the point you're trying to make and try to pull out those individual stories about yourself, about other people. You might have references to historical events. You might have science in your story. There's a lot of different components that you can pull together. But at every step of the way, ask yourself, is this holding the interest of the audience? Because at the end of the day, it is your story, but it's not about you. It's about the audience. It's about the gift that you're giving the audience. It's about what they take away. And if they're not interested, they're not listening.
Absolutely beautiful. Now, of all of the TED Talks that you have watched, can you give us your top 3 TED Talks you'd recommend anyone to watch that made an impression on you?
Oh, the top 3. Amanda Palmer gave a talk some years ago that I found to be very powerful. This was a woman who is a creative artist, who's a musician, somebody completely outside of my sphere of commonality, someone who I wouldn't think would have a story for me. So I invite you to watch Amanda Palmer's talk because it takes you on her personal journey of awakening and awareness and how she interacted in society and how society interacted with her. So that was one that I found to be very powerful. Simon Anholt gave a talk at a TED Salon event in Berlin a few years back. And he talked about the happiness index, about what makes countries happy. So this is very statistics driven. And so it's very different than Amanda's story. But what I found interesting was how he took those statistics and how he explained his process to dive into what makes people happy within any one country. Because any country is comprised of individuals, and each of those individuals are telling their own stories. So that is a very different kind of story. The third one, I'm going to go back to the speaker that I just worked with, and you need to write this down because his talk won't be out for a couple of weeks. But Paul Conroy, this is the photojournalist. This is someone who wrote a book about a woman that he worked with who was a journalist who was killed in Syria. It's called, I think it's called Under the Wire. And this was turned into a Hollywood movie. It was turned into a BBC documentary. And as I mentioned, now he's in Ukraine. And his story takes you on this harrowing journey into a city that's being bombed and what his passion was and what was driving him. And for people who have a personal story to tell, one that's going to affect society, that's one that I think people should watch. And it'll be out in a couple of weeks.
Yes, I watched Amanda Palmer. That was a very, very powerful video. And she even revolutionized how musicians can crowdfund to produce their own music. I remember watching it minute by minute. It was such an inspiring video. So thank you for reminding me of that. Now, your client's success after doing a TED Talk, can you give us specific examples of how your clients' lives changed once they did a TED Talk and what happened afterwards? Just 1 or 2 examples.
Well, success in life is often connected to the term that I like to use, which is synergy. And that's when two people's passions, when their objectives align. And so the essence of being on stage and being able to share your story, whether it's at a TED or a TEDx, whether it's at any sort of storytelling event. And the beauty of storytelling now is the digital world in which your story can come out on a podcast, your story can come out on video, your story can be out on YouTube. There are many conferences around the world that you could be speaking at if you're passionate about your topic. And what it does is it exposes your ideas to a wide range of people. And ideally, there's somebody in that audience, whether the live audience in the theater, or somebody sees your video later, or somebody hears you on a podcast and reaches out to you and says, I'm doing something which is aligned with you. In some cases, it's a matter of funding. So somebody has an idea, technology, but they don't have the money to put this into practice. And an investor will hear this and say, I have the money to put behind you. In some cases, it's somebody with a story that's very personal and they've written a book about it, but now a videographer comes into play and they connect and says, if you need help making your movie, let's sit down and talk. And for those on the social impact front, there's often times when you can connect yourself with other nonprofits and people who are influencers in your arena, so that everything is about connections and synergy. And being a public speaker in any format, especially TED and TEDx, gives you that opportunity to expose yourself to a wide variety of people now on a global basis. Because for every TED talk and every TEDx talk, those are put on YouTube or they're put on the TED channel for the whole world to see.
Mark, I could talk to you all night. You bring to us so much information about the world of impactful storytelling. What are your parting thoughts for my audience tonight?
Don't hesitate if you have a story to tell. Don't feel that because you're not a professional speaker, you're not famous, that for some reason this is something that you shouldn't be doing. I remind people that you've been telling stories from a very young age. In fact, you were a story listener from the day you were born. And by the time you were 5 years old, you were telling stories nonstop. So don't think I have to become a storyteller. You have been this storyteller your whole life. Now, by practicing and by paying attention to certain techniques, you can become a better and better storyteller. But it's beautiful that you have that foundation that you can stand up at any moment in time and start telling your story. So just do it.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much. It's been absolutely awesome connecting with you tonight. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in from all over the world. The Diversity Connector is bringing you powerful, inspiring stories from all walks of life to help inspire you to be a better version of yourself, whether you're in business, whether you're a speaker. Share your story. You were born to tell stories. They do connect us. So come back again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. I have Mark's website scrolling on the bottom of the screen, storytellingwithimpact.com. Please reach out to him if you need some support with the work that you're working on right now. But come back tomorrow. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And Mark, thanks again for the interview. Bye for now, everybody.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. So wrap everybody on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open,